Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with kind of an interesting video. I decided to make the jump to StoryGraph this past weekend. This was not all my original thought, though I've heard quite a bit about StoryGraph over recent months. And if you don't know what StoryGraph is, essentially it is an alternative to Goodreads. And it seems like a lot of people on BookTube really prefer it as a platform for tracking their reading, what genres they're reading, and everything like that. And this past Saturday, we had a Faustathon live show over on Christy Lewis's channel, where we finally got to discuss our group read, Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. After the live show was over, Naomi from Naomi's Bookshelf, whose channel I will link to down below, she talked to me and Christy about StoryGraph and about how they compile all of your stats into some really great like pie charts and things like that. It's really colorful, and that they analyze statistics that Goodreads does not, and that they actually can get incredibly specific in a way that Goodreads does not, whether that's in kind of the genres you're reading, the things you like to read, the things you don't like, or just in general their rating scale. Like I think you're able to rate up to 10 instead of just to 5, and you can do 0.5, 0.25 star ratings, which I think personally is really going to make the big difference to me. But she mentioned that essentially you can take your Goodreads and export all of the information from your Goodreads and put it into StoryGraph so that it has all of that. And I did that this morning. I thought I would take y'all along with me for that, but it seemed like it was going to take a really long time. And it actually said it might take the import over a day in case you really have a lot of stuff on your Goodreads. I think, unfortunately for me, I don't have as much on my Goodreads as others, because prior to Goodreads, and even when I first got Goodreads, I did not track my reading at all because I read so much. I was never someone who had a reading journal. I just never tracked what I read. And even when I first got on Goodreads, I did not start taking advantage of like the currently reading shelf or putting in the dates when you read something. I didn't start doing that, it feels like, until maybe 2015, 2016. 2016 really sticks in my mind as like the first year I got a year-end stats from Goodreads, and that I actually met the goal that I set for myself, a reading challenge on Goodreads in 2016. But I've had Goodreads for 10 years now. I've had it since 2012. I don't think I'm going to move to StoryGraph permanently, but I do think it's going to be interesting to try a different platform, and apparently a platform that everyone seems to really enjoy more. So I will link to my StoryGraph down below. I assume in a similar way to Goodreads, we can all add each other and be friends on StoryGraph. But the first thing they gave me, the first thing they prompted me with, were my all-time stats, which I think is so interesting. And I'll certainly look at the stats for this year at the end of the year and maybe go over them with y'all then, just kind of the books that I read this year. But what's really interesting is that they track things like mood, like the type of mood of the book that you're reading or the books that you like to read. And so I just kind of wanted to go over my all-time stats with y'all. I think this is really interesting. Again, the unfortunate thing is that there are so many books that I've read in my lifetime that are most certainly not represented here, because I've basically lost track and have no memory of what I've read and what I didn't read, especially as a teenager. Basically from the time prior to Goodreads, what I have on my read shelf are favorites, books that I know I read, especially books from series. And so I would assume that I haven't really tracked books that I truly hated or that I didn't really like, especially from the time prior to utilizing like the currently reading shelf. Before we get into the stats, one thing I will say that has already made me feel very favorably toward this platform is that apparently you can track almost anything as a book, whether it is short or not. Naomi was mentioning reading the books of the Bible and listing them each individually as a particular book, which I think is really wonderful, because maybe you haven't read the Bible in its entirety. So there's not a cap on a page count to list something as a book on StoryGraph, is my understanding, because I also looked, before filming this video, I looked at poetry because of that. And you can also list like individual poems that you've read and rate them individually. And that is something that already makes me feel like I'm going to like StoryGraph a little bit more, because maybe, like I said, maybe you haven't read the Bible in its entirety. Maybe you haven't read an entire poetry collection. Now you can go in and track each individual book of the Bible or each individual poem that you read. And of course, it will count as a book. So, I mean, in that way, I guess it does boost your stats. But I think it's personally going to be useful to me because I tend to dip in and out of things like that. And I would assume this also goes for things like short story compilations. But let me backtrack and say, for all I know, that may also be something the Goodreads allows you to do that I just have never gotten into. I don't know. I don't want to make it sound like I'm slamming Goodreads, because I am not. I really like Goodreads as a platform. I personally think its kind of recommendations algorithm could be a whole lot better. I think in general, the site looks as though it is still in 2009. It's never really had very much in terms of upgrade. I really think it is a bizarre platform, frankly, and it's very hard for me to use. Essentially, all I do with Goodreads is I get on, put a book on my currently reading shelf, and then I tick it off when it's read. I think there are a lot of drawbacks to Goodreads. I can see why people are kind of over it. And so I'm kind of excited to take this plunge. Let's go on and get into the stats. This is so interesting to me. So for my read stats, it says to me that I have read 840 books. And I think that's probably true, though it seems like on Goodreads, it tells me that I have a little bit below 800. So I'm not sure what happened there. It says I've read over 359,000 pages, which certainly I have read more than that in my time. But I think it's interesting to see it put like that. I feel like that's a low number for 840 books. But my moods, that's what's really interesting. So apparently my biggest mood of all time is adventurous. And I'm gonna click on this and see what they qualify as adventurous. Okay, basically all fantasy books are what they qualify as adventurous, and in some cases, historical fiction. And I guess I would say, this is very interesting to me because I think what I'm seeing here, and I know y'all are not seeing it because I've only screenshotted the pie charts, but it seems like the user can input kind of keywords for each book that they think they should be described as. And I would assume that that's why some of these were labeled adventurous. I think an individual person has gone in and labeled some of these books as adventurous. It makes sense, though, it really does, that most fantasy books and the historical fiction that I tend to read does seem to qualify as adventurous. Then we have mysterious, which I think is funny because prior to last year, I read almost no mystery novels. I know mysterious doesn't necessarily mean that you were reading a thriller or a mystery novel. I'm gonna click on that too. Let's just see. Well, okay, actually it does kind of qualify as books that have a mystery element, though it may not mean that the book itself is strictly a mystery or a thriller novel, which I think is very interesting. Then we have dark, which I think fits the vibe. I mean, absolutely, I have read a lot of dark books in my time. Emotional, which I think is interesting. I don't know that I read many books that I would technically label emotional. Emotional to me signals that maybe the book is outright sad. Like emotional to me, frankly, signals A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, which I frankly will never read because I have heard enough about it. I've heard enough about it to know that I don't need to be put through the ringer like that. But that's kind of what emotional makes me think of. Let's see. They label things like Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo as emotional. Actually, there was an emotional part in that. Mockingjay, some of the Last Kingdom books, absolutely. Okay, absolutely, they are emotional. Oh my gosh. Okay, A Tale of Two Cities, 100% emotional. Atonement. Okay, I agree. So they're labeling things emotional that maybe just have a big emotional component in them or a big scene, which I think's pretty interesting. I don't know that I would do that, but I kind of like it. And then we have reflective. I really don't even know what that means. I feel like I'm getting my Spotify Wrapped right here. Reflective, The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spencer. Okay, I can get with that. The Picture of Dorian Gray. Interesting. The Inferno by Dante. The Warden by Anthony Trollope. Atonement again. Okay. Frankenstein. Okay. I would have to agree. I actually think that that adjective fits all of those books. Then we have informative, which I am going to assume means nonfiction. We don't know. Let's click on it. Informative. Yes, it's a lot of nonfiction. Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. Rome, A History in 7 Sackings. But then we also have some historical fiction in here. We have Dan Jones in here, who is the love of my life. Big crush for me. We have Marie Antoinette by Antonia Fraser. So yes, a lot of nonfiction. It seems like informative is where they put all of the nonfiction that I have read, which I think makes sense. We then have challenging, and I wonder if challenging means the book itself was challenging to read or if it's just in general dealing with challenging material. Let's find out. The Idiot by Dostoevsky, Valperga, which is one of my all-time favorites, by Mary Shelley. I agree that that's a challenging read. Joan by Catherine J. Chen, which is a historical fiction. I don't necessarily think I would call that challenging, but a lot of these are classics. So I think they're talking about challenging in terms of the language, which again, I think makes a whole lot of sense. Then we're getting into smaller sections in the pie chart. So we have tense, we have lighthearted, funny, sad, inspiring, relaxing, and hopeful. And I personally need to click on sad and find out which sad books I have read. Atonement. Yeah. The Song of Achilles. Pachinko. Gone with the Wind. I guess. The Time Traveler's Wife. Oh, Lord. Yeah, that's true. We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. Oh, yeah. Okay, so all of these are books that I kind of had a good cry reading. So I would agree. Those are sad. But I don't think sad is the defining quality of those books. So I'm kind of curious about that in the mood. They have shown multiple books in different moods, which I think is valid because most books are not just one thing, but all of the books that it labeled as sad, I don't think I would necessarily say that's the point of the book. Atonement is so much more than its ending, but is the ending why it's great? It kind of is. But The Song of Achilles is the one I would say without a doubt is sad. I'll be interested to see whether this pie chart really changes or whether it kind of stays the same in terms of my mood for what I have been reading this year. I feel like I'm going to get a lot of philosophical type stuff this year. I really do. I think philosophical, if that's listed as a mood, is probably going to be my top mood of 2022, but we'll see. Then we have pace, and I think this is a really interesting stat to track that it has never occurred to me once to write this down or to make note of it, because pacing is something that I do judge a book by when I am reviewing it, but it is not actually something that really figures very strongly for me in a review, if that makes sense. I think I only notice it when I feel like the book is paced strangely. So I never really notice when a book is anything but fast-paced. I think a fast-paced book sticks out to me, and fast-paced books are actually apparently my least read in terms of pacing, only 22%, and I would say that's very true. I am not really a fast-paced reader because I think I really like to spend time with characters and I like to spend time in the writing and in the world. And so things that are fast-paced, I think often move a little bit quickly for me and they don't allow me to get a handle on everything. So I would agree. I know that this is looking at my actual stats from Goodreads, so I don't know why I'm judging whether or not it's accurate. I guess I'm just trying to see if I feel like the information came over from Goodreads correctly. Then we have slow at 38% and medium at 40%, so almost tied between slow and medium-paced books. I definitely think I prefer a medium-paced book. On occasion, I want a slow-paced book, and on occasion, I want a fast-paced book. I would say that I definitely prefer a medium-paced book, and that if I was going to step out of that, I think I would prefer a slower paced book to a fast paced book. So this is definitely a true reflection of my reading life. Page number is interesting. So less than 300 pages, 17%. I'm actually shocked the percentage is that high, because I think that's a rarity for me. I really don't think I tend to read short books. And so I'm pretty shocked that it's that high. 500 plus is 25. And I think that's pretty par for the course for me. I think once you're getting over 500 pages, I'm starting to wonder, what's the point of this? You need to start editing it down, I feel like. So my sweet spot is apparently 300 to 499 pages, or 58%. Yes, that definitely is true. I think I'm more favorable towards books that are in that page range. Nonfiction versus fiction. This is an interesting one to me because 91% fiction, 9% nonfiction. I feel like in my past, I definitely read more nonfiction. And so I'm shocked that this isn't just a little bit bigger, that this slice of the pie isn't just a little bit bigger, because I do think, especially when I was an undergrad working on my history degree, nonfiction was the majority of what I read. But I think too, when I was an undergrad, I most certainly was not tracking on Goodreads the way that I do now. So I actually don't even remember the books that I read when I was an undergrad for the most part, which is a real shame. I wish that I had been tracking them. I kind of thought maybe 20% nonfiction to 80% fiction. I don't know. Maybe year to year, that's a different story. And year to year, the nonfiction chunk is a little bit bigger. But overall, I guess this does make sense to me. Then we have genres, which I think is fascinating. So apparently my most read genre is fantasy. I agree with that. I think it is wholeheartedly true. I have loved fantasy my entire life. It is my favorite genre, so I'm not shocked to see that reflected here. Then we have young adult. I think it's interesting that they designate this because a lot of the fantasy that I have read qualifies as young adult fantasy. And so I don't necessarily, on my own shelves, I don't differentiate between young adult and adult fantasy. And I'm not really reading much that is young adult that isn't young adult fantasy. I don't really care about YA contemporary. Even YA historical can be a bit of a hard sell for me. So 9 times out of 10, when I am reading young adult, I am reading fantasy. We then have historical fiction, which is absolutely true. Prior to BookTube, fantasy and historical fiction were my most read genres. And I feel like this year I've kind of gone back to that, and I'm really happy about it. I truly love historical fiction and fantasy, and they typically wind up being my favorite books of the year anyway. Then we have classics. And I'm kind of curious about this because I wonder if they qualify certain classics under other genre designations, like historical or mystery, things like that, because I don't really think of classics as a genre. The more interesting thing to me is that underneath that is romance. And that's saying that I've read something like 150 romance books in my time. And that is a strange stat to me because most of the books that I would think they are qualifying as romance, I would not say are romance because romance is not the only plot point, if that makes sense. To me, a romance book is when the entire book pivots around a couple getting together. That's the plot. When there is a big overarching plot and romance is going on the sidelines, that tends to be what I really enjoy, but I would not qualify that as a strictly romance book. We then have mystery, which I think is interesting. I really do, because I would say, again, prior to last year, I hadn't read very many mystery books, so I kind of want to click on this and just see what they think I've read that's a mystery. Then we have history, which makes sense. We have literary fiction beyond me, and I would assume that most of the classics wound up underneath the literary umbrella. LGBTQIA+, I'm kind of curious about that. I really am. I really am going to start clicking on these. So let's go back and let's click on romance, because what does that even mean? What are they calling a romance book? Okay, they're calling basically anything that has a romance in it a romance book. I guess that's fine, and I guess it makes sense. But I don't know that I would necessarily label any of these as purely romance. Mystery, they are also kind of using as just a book that had a mystery element in it. That's not necessarily a strict mystery novel. I think that's really interesting. I agree with it, actually. I agree with LGBTQIA+ as well, because it's also pulling books that just have characters that identify as LGBTQIA+ in them, but also books that have that as a through line in the storyline, which I really appreciate, actually. So I think it's really interesting to see that represented here, like The Diviners. I didn't initially think of it like that, but it's true. We also have the picture of Dorian Gray. Pretty obvious. So I actually really like these stats and I like these designations. I most certainly have been questioning them, but when I click on these things, I do feel as though it starts to fall into place for me and it makes more sense. We then have horror, science fiction, biography, thriller, poetry, dystopian, contemporary, play, crime, middle grade, art, short stories, religion, philosophy, politics, magical realism, music, travel, etc., etc. So I think those towards the bottom are just a couple of books here and there, which again, I think is probably true because though I am a varied reader, I hop around a bit. And I think they are probably also using books that were included under other genres in those genres. Now, format is an interesting question, and I don't necessarily feel as though this is an accurate pie chart. This is where I do think I'm having a few more questions, and I don't know whether my data came over accurately, because this says I read 91% print, which I'll say is probably true. And also in the days prior to me tracking what I was currently reading, I never labeled it one way or the other. And in fact, the only time I would say that I did label a book as an ebook is when I would update with a quote and I would say in the percentage rather than on the page number. And I think that's probably all the data that they have. So actually this is accurate. This is just based on how I put things into Goodreads. But somehow it knows that I'm 6% digital and 3% audio. The curious thing to me is how they know I read 3% audio. And I have to click on that to know if what I read was actually an audiobook. Not a single one of these they've labeled as audio is a book that I listened to on audiobook. So I need to go back in and change that. But you know, it might also be how they have added in certain books, because I see Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, one of my all-time faves, is labeled as being an audiobook and it just has the audiobook cover instead of the book cover. So we have found an oddity here. Definitely we have. So this is the one that I think is probably not true. I'm not interested in tracking this myself. I really don't care whether I read something digitally on audio or physically. So it doesn't really bother me that this is inaccurate because I wouldn't track this anyway. Then we have my most read authors, which is the most exciting thing to me that they decided to track. And I don't think this will be very interesting on a year-to-year basis because I don't often read a lot by the same author in the same year. I'm just not someone who likes to stick in a world for very long or stick with the same characters very long, so I don't tend to read series in order. But this really shocked me. My most read author is still Charlaine Harris. And when I give this some thought, I really do agree with it because the Sookie Stackhouse series was my favorite when I was in high school. There were 13 books there. She also had several other series that I read, especially in my later teenage years into my early 20s. So it does track, in my opinion, that I read basically 20 of her books. Then Cassandra Clare, this also makes sense because I went through a phase where I read every Shadowhunter book and I have kept up with them. So in general, both of my top two I was reading series of. And so that's what gives them the edge, is that I actually read and completed a series by them that was very, very long. Leigh Bardugo is in my top 3 for the same reason. I would say I also think probably that Leigh Bardugo is one of my most read authors, most reread. So I'm not shocked that she's up here, and I'm happy that she is. I love Leigh Bardugo's writing. Bernard Cornwell, also up here because he has a 13-book long series, and I have dipped in and out of other series of his. So I guess it does pay to actually finish a series when you start it. Sarah J. Maas, the same reason. I have read all of her series. Anne Rice, again, the same reason. I have read, I think, the majority of what she wrote. William Shakespeare, I think, is so fun, and I'm so glad to see him up here. I think that's hilarious. But then we have Wilkie Collins. King. We love that. I love that he is in my top 10 authors. I've read 7 books of his, it says. And I believe that, I really do, but it does seem like I've probably only read 4 or 5. So I'm shocked that I've read 7, and I'm actually currently reading another one, so he may move up here soon. Juliet Marillier, who is my favorite fantasy author, I have also apparently read 7 books by, and that tracks. And then Philippa Gregory. Again, up here because I have read a series of hers to completion. And so all of my top 10, it seems like, are series writers where I've actually read and completed the series. Really, Wilkie Collins and Shakespeare stand out here as reading individual books by the author that weren't included in a long series. Here is another thing that they have messed up. It's the last stat to go through. They have definitely messed this up. It's languages. And so I don't really know how this happened. I certainly don't track things in the language in which they were originally written, but I thought that's what this was. It's not. It is the language they think you read the book in. So 794 of these I read in English. Actually, all of them I read in English. But it says, then I read in Danish. I am going to guess that Danish is my second read language because I lived in Denmark. And maybe when I purchased a book or read a book or put it on Goodreads, it tracked that I was in Denmark and possibly thought I was reading the Danish edition of the book. That would make the most sense to me. It would also explain Finnish, in my opinion, and because you could also get a lot of Finnish language books when I lived in Denmark. So I think that's possibly why these two show up there, is that Goodreads possibly mistakenly believed that I read those books in that language, because they're not even Danish books. They're not even Danish books in translation. It's just bizarre. Croatian, Dutch, German, Portuguese, Albanian, Catalan, and French are all really confusing to me because I don't even know where they got that from. I really don't. So that is definitely one of the stats that they've gotten messed up, I think. Yeah, because it thinks I read a Marie Antoinette biography in Finnish. That's what it thinks. I sure didn't. I sure didn't. But those were all of my StoryGraph stats for all time. I think this is really going to be useful if I can remember to update there, especially at the end of the year, to look back on the entire year and look at everything through these kind of pie chart lenses. I think these are really interesting stats to track, and I think it's very interesting how they separated things out. I would love to know down below if you have a StoryGraph, if you prefer it to Goodreads, but that is going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.